Okay guys, go ahead and buckle up, because tonight we're flying to Korea. Alright, a quick background note about Korea. Korea has a history of not being unified. Instead, they've had many governments at the same time, including the Three Kingdoms back in the 6th century. A major change to this will happen in the 1300s when the Joseon Dynasty is created by Yi Sun-gye. Here's Yi Sun-gye right now. Notice what he's sitting on, this red throne. You will see a picture of it in a few minutes. Now, Yi Sun-gye took the title of Taejo. Taejo is Korean and it means honored ancestor. It's also sort of a formal tradition that the beginning of a dynasty, a founder of a dynasty, goes by the title of King Taejo. Now, Taejo was very important for Korea's history. One of the biggest things he did was he chose the city of Seoul as his capital. As you'll see on the map in a few minutes, it is a very good location. It's in the middle of Korea, as well as close to the sea, and it's near a major river, the Han River. Okay, so take a look at this map of Korea. There are a few things that are interesting here. One, you can see Seoul in the very center, and this was the capital of the Joseon Dynasty. It's also the capital of South Korea today. North Korea has a capital in Pyongyang, further to the north. Now, if you look at the Yellow Sea, if you keep going to the west, you will get to China. And if you see where the East Sea is, if you keep going east, you will get to Japan. Now, the Japanese and the Koreans have a disagreement on what to call the East Sea. The Japanese call it the Sea of Japan, and the Koreans call it the East Sea. And lastly, but certainly not least, look at the very bottom of the map in the south, and you can see the island called Jeju. You should go sometime. Because I've been, here I am enjoying a delicious meal of bibimbap in Jeju Island. This was a warning sign that we saw next to one of their beaches. Note at the bottom, do not make regretful things that your family and friends feel sad by accidental mistakes. And this is me next to that beach. I can't tell if I'm blinking or if I'm taking a nap standing up. Now, another accomplishment of King Taejo is he built a wonderful palace in Seoul called Gyeongbok Palace. Here's a wonderful picture of Gyeongbok Palace at night. Notice how it illuminates at night. It looks like a very small version of what other palace that we've looked at so far. Exactly, the Forbidden City in Beijing. Good job. Now, this was the throne that I was telling you about earlier. The red throne is where King Taejo was sitting in the painting that I showed you a few slides ago. Behind it is a really famous screen, and the 5 mountains represent Korea's mythological beginnings, and then the sun and the moon represent yin and yang, or balance in Korea. So it's really famous, the screen. Keep your eyes open because you'll see it again. And as you saw in the China video, here is a map of what Gyeongbok Palace looks like. So whenever you go there, now you'll know what to look for. Notice that the layout is similar, but much smaller than the Forbidden City layout. But a lot of the buildings look the same curved roof style. So when Taejo dies, Sejong, his son, becomes the next king of Korea, and he makes it more organized. So you could really compare him to Toyotomi Hideyoshi in Japan. Like Hideyoshi, Sejong made a census, so he documented all the people in Korea as well as their possessions, what they owned, how much land they had, because this was important for, you got it, taxes. Under Sejong, all men had to carry wooden identification cards and serve in the military. This is still that way today. I believe it's 2 years. All males in Korea have to serve in the military. Females have the option of doing so, but they do not have to. And then lastly, Daejong was a big supporter of Confucianism in Korea. There is even a competition between Confucianism and Buddhism, and under his reign, Buddhism sort of lost out and Confucianism became more popular. Now, here's some things you need to know about Korea's society. They have a traditional upper class called the Yangban. This is a group of landowners, so these are aristocrats, these are nobles, and they dominated politics. China created the civil service exam so that the best people could serve the government. Okay? Korea institutes the civil service exam, but only lets Yangban take it. So only the rich can take this test to serve in the government. It's really not fair. At the other end of society, you have what's called the Chonmin. So this is the traditional lower class, sort of like a slave class in Korea. They did things like collect trash and garbage. They worked as butchers, so they handled dead animals and cut dead animals in order to produce meat that could be cooked. They worked as slaves, as laborers, as peasants on these Yangban plantations. And they worked as entertainers. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. One Direction would be Chonmin, the lowest class in society, if they were in Korea during this time period. Now, for the greatest king that we will look at in Korea's history, King Sejong the Great. Look carefully behind him, and what do you see? So King Sejong was the fourth Joseon king, and he's most famous not for conquering places, but for creating more social reform. So he reforms Korea's society. Much like Akbar, he created a fair tax system. But by far, he's most famous for creating this new phonetic alphabet in Korea called Hangul. Now, Hangul is different than traditional Korean. Traditional Korean characters are very similar to Chinese characters. So you have to memorize thousands of different characters to go with thousands of different words. Okay? A phonetic alphabet is one that you can sound out and make a word using different letters. Now this is sort of a modern take on Hangul. And if you notice, you have consonants and you have vowels. And so there's specific rules you have to use, but there are only 17 consonants and 11 vowels, so most people can memorize 28 different characters. And then they arrange the characters in different ways, and so now the effect is that more people can learn to read and write. Note, in the past, only the Yangban at the top had information and had this ability to read and write. So they were obviously those who were most important, and they dominated society. This is a total equalizer. So how did this help change Korea? As I said, with a simple alphabet, simply now more people could read and write. This leads to more books being printed, and as we said about Gutenberg's printing press, with more books, the cost of books now goes down, so now books are cheaper for people to buy. And people are enabled to buy books that affect their lives. What I mean by this are ordinary books such as health books. So if you're not feeling well, you can consult a book written in this new language, and you can very quickly see what your symptoms are, what a diagnosis could be, and then what could cure your illness. Another thing is you could actually see what the laws are now that the laws are written down for everyone to see. Then lastly, as most people in Korea were farming, you need to record the records of when the seasons have changed in the past and when you should plant certain crops and how much rainfall there has been. In English, we call this an almanac. So here's a monument in Seoul to King Sejong the Great. Notice what he's doing in this statue. Now, as we talked about with the last video, Japan makes the mistake of invading Korea twice. Now, they were successful in reaching Korea, however, they were unsuccessful in conquering Korea. Now, just because the Japanese were defeated doesn't mean that the Koreans actually won. They still suffered 2 invasions, and the Japanese did terrible things to them in their country. This included the Japanese destroying entire towns and cities. It also included the Japanese stealing important artifacts and even taking Korean peasants back to Japan and making them work for them as slaves. So you can really get a sense of why Korea and Japan still to this day have a really big rivalry. And this is something that really unifies China and Korea. They have a common enemy here in Japan. But by far, the best defense for Korea was their navy, and this was led by Admiral Yi Sun-sin. And this navy was famous for the turtle ships. This, believe it or not, is a state-of-the-art boat. It's called a turtle ship because it kind of looks like a turtle. There are a few things you should notice in the turtle ship. The first thing is it has a dragon head. Besides looking cool, the Koreans could make different color smoke come out of the dragon head's mouth, and they could even fire projectiles or missiles out of the dragon's mouth as well. On the side, you see cannons, so they're using gunpowder. As well, you can sort of see it at the end, but there's a battering ram so that literally these ships could get some speed and ram into another ship, causing it to have a hole and then to sink. Now, the traditional way of fighting a naval battle is to try to board the other ship. And so knowing this, the Koreans designed something that made it impossible for someone to board the turtle ship. If you look carefully at the roof, you can see what made it impossible to board the turtle ship. That's right, folks, spikes. So they created these very sharp spikes. So if you jumped on top of the ship, you would impale yourself on one of these spikes and then roll off the side and probably drown in the sea. If you look at the back, you can see the battering ram. If you look at the front, you can see the dragon's head. But there's really not a back or a front, considering you can row the boat in any direction. You can also see how the different portholes make it where you could fire the cannons in any of the 4 principal directions as well. And everything that we've talked about in this presentation is present in this photograph. See if you can picture all 3 items. All right, my time's up. I thank you for yours. Have a good night.